Everyone, my name is Luke Petach. I'm an assistant professor of economics in the Jack C. Massey College of Business at Belmont University, and I'm here to talk to you about my 2020 paper and review of social economy entitled Income Stagnation and Housing Affordability in the United States. In the paper, I set out to do two things. First, the first part of the paper is descriptive. I look at trends in housing affordability and home ownership across the income distribution over the course of the 20th century using census microdata. What I show is that while home ownership grew across all quintiles of the income distribution, at least over the first part of the 20th century up to 1980, things kind of changed after 1980. The first part was that home ownership declined post-1980 in the bottom quintile of the income distribution. The second thing I observe is that if you look at affordability for renters, measured as the share of contract rent and monthly income across the income distribution, you find bottom quintile, the share of rent and monthly income increases from about 28% starting in the mid-20th century to up to today around 42% of monthly income for households in that bottom quintile of the income distribution. So when you look at the trends you see for the poorest quintile families declining rates of home ownership and increasingly unaffordable rents. The second contribution of the paper takes these historical trends as given and asks, to what extent does income stagnation driven by rising income and inequality in the United States contribute to declining rental affordability? And can we tease out the effect of income inequality from other causal mechanisms identified in the literature, in particular restrictions on housing supply? And I come up with a novel method for doing this using census microdata. What I do is as follows. I take for each quintile of the income distribution, the share of rent and monthly income from census microdata and construct a series of counterfactual simulations. In the first counterfactual, I allow rents to evolve as they actually did over the course of the 20th century, but fix the income distribution at its 1960 level. The way I do this is I take mean income within each percentile of the income distribution and fix the ratio between mean income in that percentile and overall mean income at its 1960 level, but allow income to grow as it did. I then use this new series for household income to generate a counterfactual series for housing affordability measured by the share of rent and monthly income for each quintile of the income distribution that allows me to estimate the contribution of income inequality to declining affordability. Similarly, the literature identifies affordability-driven changes in housing supply by looking at the gap between the price of housing and the cost of construction. So the second counterfactual I construct restricts the price of rental across the income distribution to grow at the cost of construction using a construction cost price index from the census. Okay, I can then construct a different counterfactual for the share of rent and monthly income that allows inequality to change as it did, but fixes rents to grow at the rate price equals to marginal cost, basically. Looking at these two counterfactuals then allows me to break out the different contributions of supply restrictions and income inequality to changes in affordability across the income distribution. What I find is as follows. For the bottom quintile of the income distribution, changes in housing affordability are largely driven by changes in inequality. In particular, what I find is that basically nearly the entire change in affordability, that is that increase in the share of rents and monthly income from 28% in 1960 to 42% in 2010, can be explained, a little bit post-2010, can be explained by income stagnation. That is, if we fix the income distribution in its 1960 level, but allow actually did, the share of rent and monthly income doesn't get much above 30% for the bottom quintile in the counterfactual, whereas the actual value is about 42%. So we can attribute about 12 percentage points of the increase to rising inequality. In contrast, if I take the series where I fix prices to grow at the cost of construction, the counterfactual ends up at about 35%, the share of rent and monthly income, suggesting that rising prices deviating from marginal cost driven by supply constraints explain about the difference is about 7 percentage points between the actual and the counterfactual. So this suggests for households in the bottom quintile of the income distribution, income stagnation is a bigger factor explaining changes in housing affordability. This pattern then reverses as we move up the income distribution, and we see that supply constraints seem to matter more at houses at the top of the distribution. In the rest of the paper, I do a number of different exercises. First, I look at the share of rent and monthly income across commuting zones, and I look at and I apply the different counterfactuals across commuting zones in the US. What I find, the general results of this analysis is that cost is measured by the cost of construction seems to measure more in big coastal metropolitan areas, which is consistent with supply restrictions in those cities. So actual rent and monthly income is much higher in those cities than it would be if prices had only grown at the cost of construction, suggesting the binding constraint there is supply, whereas inequality seems to matter more kind of in the interior of the United States, although inequality also exerts an effect on the coast, right? So it actually amplifies the supply constraint effect. The last thing I do is calibrate a social welfare function to look at the welfare implications of some of these results. And what I find is that for plausible values of inequality aversion, policies that aim to fix housing affordability by reducing inequality are likely to have larger welfare effects than those aimed at fixing supply constraints. So that's the paper in a nutshell. Kind of what beyond the policy implications I just suggest, I think the paper points out a couple important implications. First, to the extent that income inequality results in unequal access to housing-related sorts of wealth and higher housing costs for non-owners, housing markets are acting as a barrier to wealth accumulation for low-income households. High housing costs and differential access to housing wealth are likely to contribute to higher relative saving for those at the top of the income wealth distribution. My results therefore suggest that housing is a key transmission mechanism from rising income inequality to rising wealth inequality. The second, and I think bigger implication, is that while much of the discussion on housing affordability is focused on alleviating local supply constraints, such as restrictive zoning, land use regulation, urban growth boundaries, this paper suggests an alternative option. In cases where it's difficult to overcome local opposition to new housing construction, state and national policymakers can nonetheless improve housing affordability by adopting policies that curtail income inequality. As I showed in my welfare analysis, for a large range of values of inequality aversions, these policies may actually produce greater increases in social welfare than the alternative. So to the extent that rising macroeconomic inequality is responsible for declining housing affordability and home ownership for households in the bottom quintile, policies that reverse income stagnation will have the added benefit of alleviating constraints placed on households by the housing market, especially among the poorest group of families.